It's actually surprisingly common that the companies don't have a repository of the insights that they get from experiments. The more experiments you run, the more kind of issues in your infrastructure you find. LeoVegas has been on a journey. The goal for last year was around 70 experiments, so that leaves us at around 6 experiments a month. I would say that's the recipe. Audit, process in RACI, and then communication in forums. I'm a big supporter of velocity. I know there's this, the quant versus qual discussion in the experimentation community, but I really do believe, especially at that stage when you go from almost no experiments to 100 or more than 100, it's so important to run as many tests as possible because you test that process. At conferences, I usually focus my talks around bridging the gap between data and the business. Or you might have stumbled upon any of the content I produce. How did Airtable save my life? Or accessibility cheat sheet that I did, by the way, with Shirley and Namrata. Or the most recent experimentation velocity.
Welcome, Luiza, on the podcast. And we're very glad to have you today because you're an award-winning CRO practitioner, but also CRO leader. Imagine we would never have met. Where could I potentially know you from? And what are you exceptionally good at in the experimentation space, you would say?
At conferences, I usually focus my talks around bridging the gap between data and the business. Or you might have stumbled upon any of the content I produced. So how did Airtable save my life? Or accessibility cheat sheet that I did, by the way, with Shirley and Namrata. Or the most recent experimentation velocity that was quite successful. We've also won, as you mentioned, the Experimentation Culture Award. So perhaps you might have heard about that. I think, maybe the networking game is quite okay.
Can you tell us why did Airtable save your life? I think I missed that post or that piece of content. Please enlighten us.
Yeah, it was actually the first quite successful piece of content I produced together with Bjarne, actually, from TomTom. How is my Airtable looking like? What are the automations you're using and what I'm using? So we put all of that together, PDF, with basic instructions. And there was so much interest into that we actually created very spontaneous conference, like a video call.
Can you tell me a little bit about the company you're working at right now? So how many experiments are you running per month there? What does that look like?
Yes, LeoVegas has been on a journey, so I'm very proud to say that we've ramped up our experimentation game, and we actually applied for Experimentation Culture Awards in the spring as well. So the goal for last year was around 70 experiments, so that leaves us at around 6 experiments a month. That's I would say, obviously you always want more, right? But that's what the maturity kind of ladder is for, and the company can always get better, and hopefully in the future, test every release that is going out, and one day become one of the booking.coms and Airbnbs, and one of those companies.
Do you think that's possible if the company didn't start out like a booking.com, it can still end up that way? Have you seen that?
There are a couple of companies that are on a really good trajectory, I would say, towards becoming a part of that club. I mean, Zalando is doing a great job. IKEA is doing excellent when it comes to, I'm now also talking about the Nordics example, so to say. H&M is running a lot of experiments as well. I wouldn't say it has to be, the beginning of the culture, and that's the only way you can succeed in becoming this experimentation giant. I think you can definitely get there with hard work, and shifting the culture and mindset is just taking time. So it's not something that will be done overnight, and it will require a lot of effort.
Can you maybe explain us a little bit more about that? Because maybe you have taken companies from point A to point B as well. And what does that look like? And what kind of things should we be thinking about if you want to, increase not only the velocity, but also the experimentation culture in a company?
In all my experiences, actually on client side, I've gone from using kind of tons definitions from experimentation culture, was from very few or no experiments at all to around 100 and more than 100 per year. The recipe is very similar, and regardless of the industry, really. You start looking at the kind of auditing, looking at what are the capabilities within the business, what are the functions that are present, such as design, product owners, analysts. Is their skill set and capability within the business? What I notice very often is that the missing piece is the development resources. If you really want to make a difference and make impact, you need development resources. And often companies forget about that. And professionals are left with these, what you see is what you get tools. And it's very hard to actually make an impact if you're just tweaking some minor changes and you're not actually validating all the code releases that are entering your product every day.
Okay, so step one of the recipe is checking which capabilities are there and kind of what are the constraints. Imagine you have found this constraint and you have found it 100 times. It's development, resources. What do you do?
So I speak to as many people as possible and understand what are the challenges and how we can improve. I build a strategy and I take it to management. So I'm very transparent and openly saying at where we are and what we need. And then it's up to the business to decide, okay, would you invest? Is this the direction you want to go in and invest these capabilities to enhance your experimentation game? Yes or no? And luckily, so far the answer has been yes in all cases, and then you can prove. Luckily, we are working with analysts, so there's a lot of calculations going on. You can put in place these frameworks and overall evaluation criteria where you can show how much added value the program is bringing to the business. It's not that hard to show the kind of return on investment for these development resources, if that is what is needed. It might be many things, whether that is the software that is needed or upskilling or development resources or making sure that you have good institutional knowledge, investing in documentation. We spoke about Airtable, for example. It's actually surprisingly common that the companies don't have a repository of the insights that they get from experiments. They are kept in PowerPoint presentations or Excel sheets. I've seen a lot of Google Sheets, and I don't think that's the way. If you want to learn from all the bulk of testing that you do, you need to have proper kind of documentation. So yeah, regardless of what it is, you lay it on the table and you discuss with management if they are willing to support.
And making it an interesting case for management is also, so you said showing added value. So that's literally showing like, hey, this is the amount of money we made from this A/B test.
Yes, exactly. I mean, better than than anyone with regards to overall evaluation criterion. It is a combination of many metrics. So one is what you mentioned, whenever there is a clear proof of increased sales or leads or whatever the main metric is, but it can also be of avoided loss, if that makes sense. So if we manage to proven that a certain release would hurt us on the bottom line, then you're able to calculate that as a saving because we did not release this change, therefore we have saved this amount of money. So depending on the business, you might have a combination of different metrics. Those are just two examples. Obviously, whenever you work with telecom, you might start looking also at costs connected to your call center operation. So I find that fascinating. The OEC game per industry is really interesting. I remember also listening to representative of Spotify at the convention was talking about the OEC calculation for Spotify. It was so fascinating to see, how these different models can look like and also how advanced they can be. Because OEC can be very simple, as you said, just looking at added revenue or avoided loss. But it can also be quite advanced if you start looking into, um, longevity metrics, other.
And I'm still trying to figure out that recipe. And maybe you haven't crystallized that for yourself as well, but you said every time that you come somewhere, you kind of go through this recipe of yours, which is first about looking at capabilities, where are the constraints, and then trying to open up the possibility there while working with leadership to make that happen. But what would be a next step? So we have solved the capabilities issue. We have developers, designers, we have everyone we need. What is next in the recipe book?
Yeah, so now you just want me to lay all my cards on the table. No, So usually how I approach things is, as I said, first you start with the audit, you communicate where the in the maturity company is, what is needed. Then once that is done and you have everything you need, obviously a lot of things are running in parallel. So you make sure that you build that documentation capability if that is not there, for example, so you create Airtable setup and all of that. But I think the very important piece is usually the roles and responsibilities. So we mentioned the kind of four most important functions, which is the designers, product owners, analysts, and then developers. What is often a misunderstanding or unclarity in organizations is who's responsible for what in this quite a complex process of experimentation. So it is absolutely critical to clarify when the handshakes happen. So you're, as a product owner, responsible for these things, and we expect you, and we will be pushing you and waiting for you for example, hypothesis sign off or a final go ahead of the test go live. Those are the things that you might depend on product owner on. Then when it comes to designers, they need to have a very clear brief when they need to start creating design, and then we'll be telling them these are the next 5 hypotheses that we're going to work on. So these are the designs we're expecting you to deliver. Just going into that nitty-gritty details of this is what we expect from you, this is how much time you might have for that particular task, and these are the formats in which you can receive them. Now, having done it for a couple of years, a lot of this obviously is automated. We try to automate as much as possible, whether that's sending hypotheses for sign off via Slack if that's faster and more approachable. So kind of clarifying these roles and responsibilities is a big part, and that goes along with the process, because obviously once you've defined the process, then you can kind of state what are the roles and responsibilities of different functions within it. So I would say process and this RACI, as we call it, is very big important piece. And once that is in place, so audits, process, and RACI, and then it's about the forums and communication. And I think you can never over communicate experimentation. I think, the more the better, the more functions in the business you talk to, the better. It's a little bit like this evangelization. You try to show added value of the previous test and things you've done with other functions, and encourage as many functions as possible to do that as well. So to stop guessing and to base their decisions on data. So it's a lot of different forms that need to be set up, whether that's, monthly experimentation forum where you share test results of all the tests from the month, or whether that is cross-functional testing forum where you meet all people at the organization that are testing. Very often there would be different FTEs responsible for testing within paid media. There will be different responsible for testing within email channel, and there will be different working with the product, so the actual website and app. So making sure that all these individuals meet and share knowledge is important as well. So yeah, so I would say that's the recipe: audit, process and RACI, and then communication and forums.
One question to go into, because I haven't heard many people speak about roles, responsibilities, and ownership of specific people. So I was just wondering what that looks like. Do you at one day create like a document that says, you as a designer, you do this is the amount of time it costs, and then you send it to them or you go have a chat with them and that's it? How do you implement this?
As everything on the client side, you need to tread lightly when it comes to roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, I can
It's
imagine.
not an easy conversation to have. But I have to say, I haven't had that much pushback in the past. And that is because we usually approach it as a conversation. So obviously, we come with suggestions since we are experts and, have done it a couple of times. So we might suggest this is how we would envisage that. Is there something you have against that, or is that okay with you? Does that fit with your schedule or the plan activities right now? So I think it's always a conversation. It's never, this is how we decide it's going to be and you just have to adapt. It's more, this is the suggestion. Does that feel tangible? And so far I have to say has been successful. What is very important once you clarify that and set that in place is to run as many experiments as possible. I'm a big supporter of velocity. I know there's this the quant versus qual discussion in the experimentation community, but I really do believe, especially at that stage when you go from almost no experiments to 100 or more than 100, it's so important to run as many tests as possible, because you test that process. You let each function within that equation, try it out. And only once they have tried it out, they can say, okay, I would like to improve this element, or maybe we can do this differently. And we're optimizers, so we're very open to any tweaks to the process. But it's just so important to have as much repetition as possible.
That's also something I actually learned from you, Luiza, that you said makes perfect. So practice makes perfect because of velocity. So because of velocity, you will become better at running an A/B test or even coming up with it and doing the whole thing. And of course, I was always already a big supporter of velocity just by creating the chances for yourself to win. But then when I heard from you, oh, it's actually also practice that makes perfect, then, the whole piece came together for me, actually.
Just based on the past 2 years, what I noticed is the more experiments you run, the more kind of issues in your infrastructure you find. And if you haven't done as many experiments in all these different areas, because you might run experiments on product pages that you don't usually do, and that highlights certain things that maybe you weren't aware of, the flags were not set up in the correct way, or there's so much learning in velocity that I just think just by doing more velocity, so more quant, you actually improve qual. I don't know if that makes sense, but in the long term, the quality of your infrastructure, the understanding of your setup, of your testing setup is so much better. In my mind, there's no other way than velocity first when you're just starting. Then, of course, I haven't had yet, unfortunately, the pleasure to work with companies that run 500,000 more than, a couple of thousands tests a year. And maybe then that's a different discussion, right? Like Melanie was talking from booking.com, they had to look at the quality, for example, and maybe at that stage makes perfect sense, right? Then you start looking at metrics on how you can ensure that quality regardless of which product team runs experiments. But at that beginning, I really truly believe that velocity is the way, and that's the only way to also spread experimentation at the company. When you test on with as many teams as possible, with on as many different pages, as long as there's traffic on them, as possible to kind of nail out all these imperfections in the setup.
And you also touched a little bit on different teams doing experimentation, from a paid media team to maybe, I don't know, a content team. How do you have any recipes for those? How do you get all those teams involved, and how do you scale experimentation through them?
Mm. Yeah, to be honest, I think that one is a tricky thing, especially within bigger organizations. So, at Electrolux, they have 40,000 employees. That's where I started. And I knew the organization quite well, but it takes so much more um, out of your energy, because at the end of the day, it's all about how much energy you put in your job, I would say, especially when you work with experimentation and you're being this evangelist and you're trying to almost not pull, but you're trying to lead the whole organization in a certain direction. And you have your job description, and in your job description it's not written that you should also try to inspire and kind of unite all the experimenters at the company. That's kind of a nice to have in your job description. And having said that, again, as an optimizer, for me at least, it's a very obvious thing to do. It's like, we are all running experiments, we need to be aligned, let's leverage on the same software if that's what it takes. Or maybe you're not running as many tests yet, would you like us to help you with either skill set or the framework or process, whatever it is. I think the functions that are maybe ahead can support the functions that are not up and running yet. So there's so much to gain from that, but at the end of the day, it really is left down to how much energy you have left in your bank for that, extracurricular activities that are not a part of your job description. I mean, I always give 200% of myself in every job I do, but it comes at a cost and it takes a lot of energy.
Also, if you work within a larger organization and you have these different teams, you will probably also see that one team will learn everything really fast and will start running experiments and will be super enthusiastic to do so, while other teams might look completely different. They struggle to run an A/B test or an experiment. They feel like, oh, it's costing us extra time. How do you approach that difference between people and teams?
And on top of that, there's different software that the teams use, right? So
Yeah.
already early on, I remember, when working with paid media teams, I think often, and now this is not my area of expertise, so I might say some names incorrectly, but I think they had this studio where they could automatically generate, a lot of different variations of content types for the ad testing, which obviously takes a lot of kind of pressure off your shoulders when it comes to design. So they were able to automate that. Whereas for us, for any design change on the product, you need the designer and you need the development resource to do that. Now, obviously, those are, I'm talking about 2018. Nowadays, it's better.
Yeah.
I don't think it's all solved, but it's getting there. So it's like depending on the tool set that you have available, it will always be on a different level, and it's more about this. I think being humble, and if there's another function that is doing better, learn from them. That's excellent. I haven't had a situation like that. It was usually the product team that has been leading in terms of velocity, and the other functions have been learning from us. But if the role was reversed, I would say I would be very open to learn as much as possible from those functions and try to unite efforts. Because again, coming back to communication, the more communication you do jointly as well in different forms, you have different stakeholders you talk to, the better.
And what about the case of teams not really moving when it comes to experimentation? So one of the, I work with a lot of larger organizations as well, and there is always that one team that says like, yeah, we don't want to run A/B tests because it costs us more time. What do you do with them?
Often experimentation starts as something tactical to improve sales, but it can be so much more if you take it to different forms and different functions. So one area like that could be compliance and legal. So, testing any legal changes that might be implemented. Very often they know in advance if the legislation is about to change. So what you can do as experimentation function is to try to estimate what impact that would have before it goes into the effect. And that can be very powerful for your financial planning, for example. So then you start entering more strategic discussions with management. So you go from, yes, making a difference on the tactical level, but also entering these strategic discussions. Yeah, usually when functions are hesitant and they don't want to run tests, at some point you also need to let them kind of digest it a little bit. So I wouldn't come knocking on the door of the function that doesn't want to run tests every day. I would absolutely try to share as much as I can, and show examples and kind of take them by the hand. But what I try to do is always at least to have one example. So let's try to do one test together. Maybe we can come up with one hypothesis together. And if that works, great. That usually then leads to more. If that doesn't happen, that's also fine. I try to loop these stakeholders into our communication forum. So, that's okay that you don't want to run it now, but come to our monthly experimentation forum, listen to what we're doing in other functions. But again, talking about, how much effort you put into everything throughout your day. If there's a function that clearly gives you a no, you don't want to spend too much time there. You would rather work with people that have given you something and a little bit of that kind of energy back to basically put your energy and resources where it will be fruitful.
On another topic, have you ever worked with a CRO agency or have you ever worked at a CRO agency?
Yeah, so now we're coming to my favorite topic, and I think your most recently revived product value proposition, which I absolutely love. I do think that experimentation should be done in-house, but I do think there are benefits to bringing a partner early on, particularly if you don't have the capability in-house to teach the organization and the analysts or developers or designers, so whatever.
Yeah. Because that was step one of your recipe, right?
Exactly. So,
Yeah,
if you don't
capabilities.
have someone like me or you that has done this before, I think it's really hard to know all of it.
It
Do you know
is.
what I mean?
Yeah, no, it is.
You need that expertise and that knowledge to come, whether that is from someone in-house that you hire or whether that is from an agency that you bring on. And very often, actually, it comes from an agency, whether that is a specialized CRO agency or it might be very often a paid media agency would suggest experimentation of some kind of their content and their ads. I would say that's a very natural way. I think it's also built in all the tools they use. So that's often how it comes, but it can come from a design agency, as it was in case of Electrolux as well. So yeah, I would say that beginning is definitely really beneficial to have someone that has done this before and knows about experimentation in practice to kind of spark that initial curiosity and to be able to build on that setup. So I haven't worked at specifically CRO agency. I worked on agency side. At that point at Precis Digital, there was a CRO team led by Jara, who's amazing, and I believe she's still there. But it's quite a small team. It doesn't, have that many different clients. So it's not, obviously Precis is not a specifically experimentation led agency like Conversionista, let's say, is in the Nordics. But they are doing that as a part of the offering that they have, which is great. So most of my experience has been on the client side, and in many cases, when I started with experimentation, I worked with consultants. And then over time, I was able to bring those resources in-house. Actually, right now at Electrax, still the experimentation is run in-house. And similarly, at other experiences, I was actually hired as a replacement of a consultant within telecoms. And yeah, now at LeoVegas, it's also all in-house. So I do think there are many benefits that come with that setup. Once you have stakeholders in-house, it's just so much harder to do all of this mindset switching when you're not even in the same building. I think admire all of the CRO agencies. I think it's an impossible job to do, especially when you don't have any say about the budget. I think it's so important to have budget ownership. Very often, when you're a consultant, you're maybe not as encouraged to give feedback to the organization because obviously it's who's paying your check, and that's the best benefit of an in-house CRO specialist that can just say things how they are. So if this is lacking, this is the gap, that's the reality. And if you need resources, that's what you can clearly say. We need FTEs, we need better software, we need to have a budget for documentation. Whatever it is, you can ask for it. You can demand it even. Whereas as a consultant, there's nothing you can demand. You can suggest and recommend, but there's no request that you can kind of lay forward.
Imagine a company hires external resources and eventually they want to bring it in-house, but they don't. What do you think will be the effect? I think you said something about that culture is very hard to change, mindsets from an external perspective. Anything else you might see that wouldn't work out if, zero resources are external?
Yeah, I think it really depends from one organization to another. I really do understand that there are some organizations that are simply too small to hire in-house such a niche expertise. And in those cases, I think fair enough. It's better that you do some experimentation with the agency than not doing any experimentation at all. I think particularly in the Nordics, it's quite common that you would ask for help of consultants in smaller companies and then hire someone in-house. But it comes with shortcomings, I think. So I would say, you might mentioned you have lack of budget ownership, you have lack of negotiating power, really. You're not invited into the strategic meetings where you can get the context and start introducing this more strategic part of experimentation. Because as consultant, you're not, always privy to all of the company's, secrets. Yeah, and it's kind of, there are pros and cons, I think, of both cases, because it's also when you're trying to hire in-house, it's very hard to find the talent. You know, the experimentation community is small. There are a lot of awesome people, but um, you know, they are all taken. They all have jobs. So I remember when the hiring at the very beginning was very, very hard to find, you know, I'm talking 2018, to
Yeah.
find people with experience in experimentation. It was very hard to do. So
Mhm.
either then you know, you steal one another from the agencies, you
Yeah.
know, which is not very popular then with agencies, but you do what you gotta do, or you train. You basically hire for mindset, and you lay all the knowledge on the person that you hire. So I do think there are pros and cons to both. Yeah, when you're in house, you kind of can talk to any stakeholder that is at the organization. You have this access to all of it. As a consultant, you might be just privy to a very small part of it, let's say a product organization, but you would never be able to do it at the scale, you know, not to mention cross-functional testing forum and all the testers. Forget that. I think that would be very hard to do for someone from outside. On the agency side, it's also easy to perhaps switch tech, so you can be an expert in all the software at the same time, whereas in-house, you know, you're stuck to the infrastructure that is for that particular client.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for sharing that. And maybe as a final question, how did experimentation change you and your career overall? Because you haven't always been in the experimentation field, so I'm very curious to learn about that.
Right now, at this moment, experimentation is my career. I can't imagine it being any different, really. You know, sometimes when I talk to the colleagues who I knew from before I entered the digital world and experimentation, they're envious about all of the different data points that we have our hands on in digital world and we have access to. Because when I worked in physical marketing and retail, it was very hard to collect any meaningful data, statistically significant data. That continues to be the lure of this digital world, that you can track as long as there's consent, or you can track whatever the consumers are doing within digital space. And that's measurable, and that was very hard to do. So there was a lot of opinions in retail and physical world. So I'm very grateful for the exposure I receive, and you know, being a woman in the space, which is, we're still a minority, we are given opportunities which perhaps otherwise wouldn't be there 10 or 20 years ago. So yeah, I'm very grateful, and I feel like experimentation didn't just change me, it shaped the professional that I am today.
Luiza, I really enjoyed learning your secret sauce to installing experimentation programs, which came down to audit capabilities, setting up the process, and then focus on communication. And communication can never be enough. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for your time.